Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the Daily Survival. My name is Faraz Patel. I'll be in your company for the next 45 to 48 minutes. Well, my next guest is somebody who's no stranger to ITV networks, and she's no stranger to having her books on various shelves on bookstores across South Africa. From the time she wrote the book, Daughters Are Diamonds, back in 2007, and 14 years later, she continues to inspire through literature and writing books. It's none other than Sister Shafinaz Hassam, and we'd like to introduce her and welcome her to the show. Sister Shafinaz, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and Jazakallah so much for joining us.
Wa alaikum salam, Brother Firaz. Thank you so much for making the time. It's a pleasure to be here.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, and Jazakallah for you for making the time. Sister Shafinaz, when one speaks of an author, it's all the nice glamour and glitz when you're going and presenting the book, but it's the hard work that goes into it, the thinking that goes into it, the topics, the style of writing. These are so much of facets that go into writing a book. Just give the viewers an idea of the attention to detail that you need to make sure that not only is this book accurate, but it's something that appeals to the public.
Well, I think writing is a labor of love. There's no other way to put it. It sounds cliche, but it really truly is, because it tests you in so many ways. I'm a very pragmatic person, and I remember back when I was writing Sophia, the novel, you think to yourself, well, you can write a book in a month. That's what all the sort of writing gurus say, So if you just take 28 days or 30 days and count, by 3,000 words a day, you'll have a 90,000 word manuscript. But writing really humbles you once you take that first step of the journey, because it takes something out of you. It requires your full sort of, you put your life into it. And so it's not a frivolous activity at all. And the attention to detail is more also, at the same time, while we judge ourselves when we write, because you start to think, who's going to read this? Is it making an impact? Will it make a difference? Will people enjoy it? It's also about, authenticating your material, because you have a contract of trust with your reader. You want readers to be able to really relate to the text, really engage with the text. And so it is about creating those characters, about writing and presenting what you've got in mind, but also about that trust that you develop for your reader, so that they don't lose interest. And so there's a lot of thought that goes into the conceptualizing process of getting a book together.
Shafinaz, and a lot of your books are, one of the central themes is, of course, none other than that of woman empowerment. And we are going to be touching on some of the work that you have done from 2007 right up until now. Woman empowerment. And it's such an important topic, because whenever we discuss woman empowerment, there's so many people who say, no, women deserve to be in this place. They don't deserve to be in the world of literature, or any supposed field that has a progressive side to it. So how important is women empowerment, especially for our Muslim sisters out there who see this as something that could be some sort of a taboo tab that is put on them if they want to go ahead and explore things the legitimate way and the halal way?
I think it needs to be said, look, when I wrote Daughters Are Diamonds back in 2007, there was some amount of consternation. Actually, I should say when I wrote it, the research for it was done back in 2003, because it formed part of my thesis. And I was looking at how Muslim women are configured in South Africa within what's called a traditional or a patriarchal setting. But given the access that we have to our primary text, which is the Quran, and the traditions of the Prophet ﷺ, which is the Sunnah, and when you understand your rights and responsibilities through just those two significant texts in our lives, you realize that we have significant responsibilities, but we have substantial rights as well. Women today are a lot more political. Our generations now understand far more, that it's not as much as the Western media portrays Muslim women to seem oppressed and denying of rights, or denied of rights in various spaces and voice and a seat at the table. That's actually not true if we look at our traditions across the generations. And we have started to reclaim that. We have started to present ourselves with greater force, greater voice, greater pride. And writing is just one of those things, certainly not a new thing. It's been over over years and decades, that women, that mothers, that sisters are educated, educating themselves and transferring that knowledge to the next generation, whether it's through the oral tradition, sitting around and discussing hadith in talim groups, to lectures in huge universities around the world, and online platforms, or in the written form of writing poetry, writing our hadiths, writing analyses, or writing fiction stories. So I think that that myth needs to be dropped. There's definitely, the space is being taken up, it has been taken up, and in fact it has been reclaimed. And more we are seeing, even from within our Muslim communities, authors, Muslim women authors, writing and making their stories heard to the greater public.
You mentioned, during the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and a lot of people, those with the, how would I like to call it, the non-progressive thinkers would say, okay, this new woman empowerment thing is a 21st century, theory. It's given by the West. The West have given women too much of freedom, so on that basis, we need to put them back. But over 1400 years ago, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and through our mothers, Bibi Fatima radiallahu anhu, Hazrat Khadija radiallahu anhu, the Anbiya before, Hazrat Maryam alayhi salam, Asiya, who was of course the foster mother of Hazrat Musa alayhi salam. These were women that by themselves took care of such important figures of Islam. And you look at it centuries and centuries later, you see that woman empowerment is something that is not new.
So to take the word that you used, I don't think you actually have non-progressive thinkers watching ITV, considering your content is, so thoughtful and thought-provoking. But non-progressive thinking is against the Sunnah. And that's as simple as I can put it. Because we are given the ability for reason, thought, conjecture, and discussion on various topics. And yes, a very powerful tradition. Just to look at Muslim women from the beginning of Islam, and the kind of stories and narratives and learning that we have to grasp from there. So definitely there's a strong tradition. There's a great and wide sort of appeal that we have to draw on, learning from them. And so it really is about reclaiming, and it's not about reading. As soon as we start to look at our traditional sort of reading Quran and the Sunnah from a patriarchal perspective, we deny ourselves the real power of what's meant by really taking on and really living our lives as responsible and as Muslims. And it's something that needs to be discussed, because we are a political community, we are a global ummah, we are aware of the impact that each of us has on each other, from family to community to clan to nation state and to the global ummah. And when we understand that domino effect that we have, you start to conduct yourself in a more finite way. On the one hand, in a more we use more empathy, but at the same time realizing that we do have an internal power to make a difference, a personal power to make a difference as well. I think more and more, I'm pleased to say that more and more we are seeing an impetus and more traction of people actually taking on, doing things in various fields around the country, around the continent. South Africa, we have a lot to be thankful for. We live in a country where we can practice our Islam very beautifully, very openly, very freely. People are conscious about what it is to be Muslim, what it is to wear the hijab or even the niqab. And there's a conjecture and discussion around it. Of course, fear does tend to create a certain amount of distrust or dislike, but we have ways of building those bridges, and communication and writing is a way of giving people a window into our world, into social issues faced by our children, our communities, our women. And it's just a way to realize that we're all faced with these difficulties. We just have maybe new ways, unique ways of coming together and finding solutions to enhance greater society.
Well, we're just getting the conversation started with Sister Shafinaz Hassam. After the break, we will be going into her books, and of course, one of those books, the first one that she ever wrote back in 2007, which is Daughters Are Diamonds. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to the Daily Survival live here on ITV Network's channel 347. I'm in conversation with Sister Shafinaz Hassam, author and a public sociologist. And of course, the amount of titles, books that she has written is quite a lot, but it's so thought-provoking and interesting to read. And one of them we are going to touch on is one of her first titles, which was Daughters Are Diamonds: Honor, Shame and Seclusion, a South African perspective. And Shafinas, how important was it that, we looked at home instead of looking beyond our borders to actually tell the story of, what goes on in the homes of our Muslim women, our Muslim sisters here in South Africa?
Well, it was absolutely necessary. As a young researcher, obviously, I started off looking and interviewing people I had better access to. It was a wide network at the time and different age groups. And I wanted, on the one hand, to create a social document. I wanted to document our stories. But at the same time, I wanted to look at the sort of intricacies of what it means for Muslim women to have autonomy within the space of the home. So, for example, we talk about having autonomy in your professional space, but once you cross over the threshold of the home, how much of that autonomy is denied Muslim women? And for the Western sort of media, the assumption is that autonomy is denied by the fact that you live in Islam or that you are a Muslim. And so that was where the breakdown and also the responsibility came in, was to document those stories, yes, but at the same time to understand that oppressive structures don't come from our reading of Quran, but from our patriarchal interpretation of what's expected and what's, and so that breakdown needed to be had. Those discussions needed to be had. I'm certainly not the first person to have done that, but it was in an early stage for the South African space, and it's led to numerous conversations and discussions, numerous writings, both by myself and very many writers around the country. And yes, it was, and it continues to be important because remember, we're also writing for dynamic times. Our generations change, our ways of thinking change, and times change. So it's important to continue to document what happens and to create a kind of continuum where we can research and understand what it is about our thinking and how far we've come as well. And I've said before that we are a highly political thinking. When I speak of politics, I'm not just talking about the politics of the country. Wearing a hijab is a political action. So we are highly conscientized to what it means to be a Muslim woman in South Africa, what it means to be a Muslim in South Africa. And when we hold our space proudly, and writing is a way of both capturing that, but extending the conversation with readers, because I may not be able to reach every person in the country, but I hope that my books do, in some or other way, impact, enhance conversation. People must be either thrilled, delighted, or very upset enough to come to the table and say, but this is what we agree and this is what we don't agree. Write another book about it. And this is conjecture. This is what it means to create that ongoing dialogue.
Shafinas, there are various characters that are there in the book. I'm not going to mention all of them, but each character has a specific challenge that she is dealing with. But what one can take from all of this is that they're dealing with the issues of toxic masculinity and patriarchy. And how important was it that you needed to, mention these challenges which are blocking the woman within the book? Because as a man, I can sit back and say, well, I don't really know much of it because I'm not in the shoes of the woman. It takes a Muslim sister to understand these challenges. And am I right in saying only they can understand it because they are the ones that are personally experiencing it?
But then writing also gives us an opportunity, like I said, to build bridges. You engage empathy when you read about the experience of somebody in whose shoes you might not be. The thing with Daughters Are Diamonds as a research, firstly, Daughters Are Diamonds is a critical title. And the thing with the book as a form of research is that it created, this platform in order to maybe just put down 5 or 6 different sisters' experiences. Obviously, their names were, were not used in the actual names were not used, but it just creates a talking point for us to say, well, what are their particular experiences and why is it this way? Each of them comes from a different generation, and they were from different sort of professional backgrounds. And so, yes, I think it is really about writing that creates empathy, that engages empathy in the reader, because you read this book and you say, well, I didn't know that was actually happening. You may not actually feel it, but you create an understanding for it, which is a nice way to, to bring the conversation to the table and to create voice, to give voice to it. And what I did from there is I took Daughters Are Diamonds as a starting point. It was my original thesis. It talks about diamonds, the objectification of women. The subtext on it is honor, shame, and seclusion, a South African perspective. So it talks about concepts of shame and modesty, what it means for us, what it means in the literature throughout research through the ages. And it also talks about that if women are objectified, then what does this mean for society going forward? Because then her thought processes and her thoughts and her autonomy, her ability to make decisions are not given due sort of consideration. What does that mean for, because women are influential in various spaces around South Africa, starting from the home, with the children, and going out into the communities, whether it's community-based organizations that are doing so much of good work around the country, and every professional space you can think of. Muslim women are making strides and creating, huge sort of waves of influence in so many ways, and have been all along. It's certainly not a new thing as well.
Yeah, and we will be touching on that in the final segment of the show. Shafina, as you speak of empathy, how important is empathy in understanding not only the book, but the real life situation which this book is based on, that a lot of our sisters go through? Because it's easy to say, well, you know what, we don't really need to put ourselves in their shoes, they must deal with it in their own way. But having that empathy, as you say, crosses the bridge and brings us as men to understand the real life situations that they go through.
I think that look, it's easy to step back when somebody is experiencing difficulty, and sort of maybe it's a fine line to step back and say, well, it's not my problem. But we all have a role to play, and it doesn't just happen across the table with a therapist. I think that sitting around with the family, you'll often find, somebody might need to speak. It could be a group of women sitting together, or a book club. Sometimes you find the safe space in the form of a book club where they've read a book and now they discuss something that relates back to their own lives, whether it's gender-based violence, or whether it's bullying in the classroom in the case of children, or workplace demeanors or harassments of some sort. So these stories come through the form of a book. It makes them more palatable. It makes people say, well, this sounds familiar. I heard a story like this because my cousin experienced it, or this sounds like my story. It actually gives voice to sometimes things that people don't know how to deal with, and it can happen around a dinner table, a family dinner table. Discussions can be a way to. A book can create a discussion that can be create an impetus for solutions. And so, like I said, we all have a role to play. You don't have to be, hold the title of a therapist or an interventionist of some sort. And books and stories over the years, over the eons, have always been a way to both transfer knowledge, but also empower people to make decisions for the positive good of both their families or their communities, in whichever way it is. I've written about human trafficking recently. And it's a hot topic, especially after the World Cup, where our borders in South Africa became more porous. Now imagine the idea that we're hearing about children going missing from shopping malls, or children getting kidnapped, and you start to wonder, what is happening? Why is this happening? What are the different reasons that this is happening? And the human body has become a commodity where it's easily traded from poorer, unresourced countries or unresourced villages, and children are taken away and sold on a higher market. And it's a huge problem because it denies people those rights. It vilifies children from various backgrounds, and it feeds a massive global crime. And we have that problem in our midst in South Africa. The stats might not be hugely significant, but I think, any one or two is hugely significant. And so I've written about that as well. And it has reconscientized people into understanding why this is a problem in South Africa and what can be done to kind of overcome it or to safeguard ourselves from this kind of occurrence.
Yeah, we are going to be touching on that book in a bit. But after the break, the conversation with Shafinaz Hessam does continue. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to the Daily Survival. I'm in conversation with author and public sociologist Shafinaz Hessam. We are discussing some of her books and, of course, relating to women empowerment and the current everyday living of so many women who are facing challenges across South Africa. Shafinaz, the three books that I want to try and see if I can cram it into this section. Of course, Memoirs for Kimia, Sophia, and the Economics of Love and Happiness. Memoirs for Kimia is a poetry, you were saying just before we went on air, and that is something that is ongoing, am I right?
That's correct. So poetry has always been a joy or a joyful outlet for me. And I started blogging back in 2005, a blog called Memoirs for Kimia. So Kimia was the adopted daughter of Mevlana Rumi, who's one of my favorite Persian poets. And so it was just sort of a pen name, Kimia. And I started blogging back then. And then in 2009, I pulled all those poems together and I had them published in the form of Memoirs for Kimia, the book. So it was an experimental project, but it brought huge joy. It's been a long while. I do continue to write. I have a collection called Soul Seeds for Shade and Solitude that brought me some joy as well. I think it's just, sometimes it's just a way of, between the sort of heavy research and the sort of deeper writings, poetry is just a way of reconnecting with myself. So it's been a special delight to have some of that.
You talk obviously about blogging, which started in 2005, and it was something that was relatively new, especially here in South Africa. How was it entering that space into something that was really new, and now, of course, 16 years later, it's become something that is just part and parcel of the digital world?
So back in 2005, we must have been about 8 or 10 bloggers that kept in touch. It was literally like speaking into an echo chamber. But I made some great writer friends through that. And it was a nice way to sort of test your writing because you knew like 8 or 10 people were reading it at the time, and there was a sense of community. The blogosphere sort of exploded after that. And I think even the pandemic has sort of put this idea of being online and using the online space so much speedier. It's put us into it so much faster. The technology existed. I think we just didn't take advantage of it like we are doing right now. So it's all a learning curve.
Yeah, we're living in that digital world, and we're living in that time where, everything is just moving so fast. And we've got social media also that helps contribute to that. Shafinaz, let's move to Sophia. And I think this is a very important book because it speaks of the domestic violence. And this is something that happens in so many homes, even in our Muslim homes. And even if we try to shift it away because we want to try and protect that marriage, domestic violence is something that we cannot accept, number one. And number two, it needs to be called out. When writing this book, when basing your character on it, just give the viewers an idea of how you had to sit and transcribe what is happening in real life in so many homes into this book to tell this, daunting story.
So back when I was researching for Daughters Are Diamonds, a lot of the narratives came together. So what happens when you obviously transcribing the research, themes kind of jump out at you and you're looking for these themes in order to analyze them, obviously. And it wasn't enough for me to put it into Daughters Are Diamonds because I realized that fiction is such a powerful way. Back then, I was writing short stories, and fiction is such a powerful way of making an impact on a reader as compared to analyzing a lot of data that can be so filled with jargon most of the time. And so each has its place. And so, with that in mind, I started creating the characters for Sophia. Back then, the working title was called The Silence of 100 Tongues because of the silence around the violence, the abuse, and that sort of thing, various layers of it that happened. And and so what was interesting, I remember in one of my earliest interviews with Sophia, with a channel that wasn't just sort of, it was a mainstream channel. And they said, but the character in the book, the male character, he's never touched alcohol, but he's still an abuser. And it was one way of breaking down the myth that you don't have to be drunk in order to give into rage and sort of this illogical behavior, so to speak. So what happened was from those interviews, I was able to do two things. The one is get into the mind of the abuser, who is in some ways a victim of his own conditioning and trauma, and get into the mind of the abused and how protective she is of her space, of her marriage, of presenting herself in a glamorous way to society and to her family. And the third was to create the characters of children experiencing this. In the case of this couple, a little boy and a little girl, and how they configured this abuse, what they were seeing, the drama that ensued around it, and how they related to their parents because of it. So all of this came down to really getting into the skin of each character. And when I talked about the social contract earlier of the authenticating the material, really feeling what these characters might have experienced by speaking to numerous women, but mostly trying to relay the message that there is kind of self-preservation in our society, and this idea that it's hush hush, it's a taboo topic, it's not something that we discuss. But then how are we going to create the unique solutions that we need? It's not just about drug abuse or alcoholism that perpetuates this, but that that's generational trauma that needs to be worked on, that there's a kind of power dynamic that needs to be shifted, and that children are then affected by this, that it becomes again a recycling of this trauma. And so there's just a whole lot of layers that then need to be dealt with. And a novel was a great way to open the door for those kinds of discussions.
And Shafina, as you know, writing is one thing, but the real life situations that so many families go through, especially our sisters and our Muslim sisters, gender-based violence. We saw again 2 years back when the murders of so many women took place in South Africa. It came back again. As a society, what needs to be done? I know it's not going to be something that we're going to go ahead and cure overnight, but as men, as guardians for women, what needs to be done in order to make sure that even though we do not eradicate gender-based violence, which is another pandemic on its own, but we can play a part in protecting our women against this violence and protecting them who are so vulnerable?
I think that these discussions, conscientizing people and creating an understanding of the various ways in which gender-based violence occur is definitely an ongoing project. And yes, men, it is a space of not keeping the covers drawn, not keeping the curtains drawn. And men have become a lot more involved and conscientized about the role that they need to play in eradicating this pandemic, as you say. So it isn't something that just resurges now and then. It really is ongoing. We live in one of the most violent societies in the world. As proudly South African as we are, we do identify that we have these issues that need to be dealt with in so many different ways. Poverty is already a form of violence in our country to a majority of the population. Add to that lack of access and domestic violence within in the intimate space, and femicide, where women are actually killed by intimate partners. And we realize that this is a long drawn process of trying to undo the harms and the difficulties. And so government definitely needs to play a greater role. I think that resources need to be put into the eradication of gender-based violence beyond just being a talking point. And we can play a role as individuals in our communities, in our homes, in our spaces, so that the next generation is better geared to be able to and better equipped to deal with to manage anger, to deal with issues that crop up. There's levels of healing that need to be had in a post-apartheid society, in a poverty-drawn society, in a society where there are mixed metaphors around what it means to engage empathy, to be there for the next person. So there's so many layers of dealing with this, and to find ways to assist and help perpetrators, whether those perpetrators are men or women, and whether those victims are men or women. We have a huge role to play as a society in undoing violence at the various levels that it occurs.
Shafinaz, the one last book before we go to the break, The Economics of Love and Happiness. This is another book. It's one of those that when you look at it, you think the deep-rooted ills of society is right over there. This is a one, of course, that spoke of human trafficking and just how vulnerable so many of our young girls are. Because, as you mentioned, when the borders were sort of like open to a certain extent just after the World Cup, it felt as if these kidnappers or those who deal in the illegal human trafficking just could go ahead and do what they do without any recourse. Give us an idea of this book and, of course, comparing that to the real life instances of so many youngsters who get taken into this world and into this dark place.
So when I talk of borders, what happened is I think the World Cup put the spotlight on South Africa, and unlike Europe, our borders, in terms of taking children across, were not as defined, and still, it's easier to get a loophole by a trafficker to get a child across the border than it is for a single parent to take their child out of the country for a holiday, because you follow protocol and you get your papers in work in process and all of that. So one of the things that happened is take one of the examples I use is take for example, you put on a nice sports jacket and with the name of a fancy sports club from Europe, and you go into the townships or into the villages, and there's a family with maybe 8 or 9 mouths to feed, and you identify two kids on the soccer field, and you tell that family, we'll give you 1,000 rand, it's a random amount, and we'll take your son across to Europe and he'll have the best sports scholarship. But we just obviously need his documentation. So they legitimately sort of get the documentation, but then these children are taken across and sold for, any number, maybe 10,000 euros out in Scandinavia or Belgium or wherever it might be. They're trafficked. Those families don't have the resources to follow up what happened to those children. Years go, they probably never hear from them again. Some of those children may be recruited back into the system, maybe brought back to their village, dressed well, expensive kicks, nice sports gear, pick up 2 or 3 other kids. So this is the kind of, the way the crime network works. Some are trafficked within the city. So then, you have these brothels operating. And we're not talking about the movies. A brothel doesn't necessarily look like this strange place in a red light district. It's, it could be a B&B. So the difficulties of identifying and the way that crime sort of is integrated in society, just for the cause of transferring money for the sake of, exchanging the body for money in so many different ways, through forced migrations, through human trafficking, through prostitution. These are kind of themes that I've dealt with in this particular book.
Shafinaz Hassam, our conversation will continue after this break. We will be wrapping up this very interesting conversation with this amazing author and public sociologist. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Daily Survival. I'm wrapping up my conversation with Shafinaz Hassam, author and a public sociologist. Shafinaz, the one book that you are telling me of air that is a continuing work is the Nisa Kamar and the young adults. When dealing with continuous work, is it something that you follow in terms of society? How do you base the work that you are doing on a continuous level with regards to that specific title?
So this series has given me the greatest amount of joy from all of my writings. I think when I was a young reader, I read the Enid Blytons and the Hardy Boys and the Nancy Drews, and our kids are reading such a wide variety, whether it's Harry Potter series or, I think I always wanted to be able to put out a story that I could identify with. So back in 2016, I envisaged this concept of writing a local story about a young Muslim girl growing up in South Africa. And so the Nisa Kamar series was born of that. And book one deals with, it's called Nisa Kamar and the Master of Jinyaville. So
Yes.
it's your typical good versus evil story, the triumph of good versus evil. And Nisa is a 10-year-old girl growing up in Joburg. She goes to an Islamic school, and she deals with all the sort of the normal shyness that a young girl deals with being in school. But what happens is she becomes the star of her school, the hero of the story, because there's a mystery to be solved. Her school has to be saved from the Master of Jinyaville. And her granny, in particular, this is not a story about magic and magic wands. Her granny teaches her the verse of the throne, which obviously is Ayatul Kursi, and the power of using the verse of the throne to protect yourself from basically the unseen. So this is how I configured story one, and it had huge impact. It created a lot of sort of perhaps joy and some conversation about writing about things that we haven't really spoken about. And even in the story, they don't use the word jinn. The kids call it the J folk because it should not be named. So there's this kind of hush hush around the story, and how that works. But what I did then, in the beginning, I don't think I thought that Nisa Kamar would develop as a series. It was just delightful to be able to write book one. But it almost seemed to have demanded it of me. So Nisa Kamar book two is called The Rainbow Healers Society. And Nisa's a year older, it's a new school year, and she deals with bullying in the classroom. And they create the study group called the Rainbow Healers Society, where the kids kind of get together and protect each other, and they learn about different things. So that was book two. And then book three is called The Legend of Kothar, which on a trip to Cape Town, the children discover the legend of Kothar, which is about the fountain of Kothar, which is a story of abundance, and how the Quran teaches us that if you are grateful, you will get more out of your life. So each of them deals with something that is very sort of distinctly Muslim, distinctly Islamic, but at the same time, it's a local, proudly South African story. And finally, this year we launched book four, which is called The Circle of the Astrolabe. And with the Circle of the Astrolabe, the kids have an environmental issue that they have to solve, where the city of Joburg is bubbling with a green slime through all the drains, and there's a big green cloud hanging over. So schools close and they start to wear masks, and they have to go online and stay home. And the kids have a limited amount of time to figure out what this problem is and what's causing it, so that they can save the city of Joburg from this green slush that's taken over. So
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of a current pandemic that we are going through, staying at home, wearing the masks, and of course doing everything online. And that's how I want to touch on it, Shafinas, because each of these Nisa Kamar books, there's a heroine, and there's a girl who's also trying to find herself in these strips. You look at it, when you look at the age gaps, especially from the years of 10 to about 19, so many of us, including us as boys, want to figure out, want to discover what we are about. So how much of the real life situations do you look at it and say this can be used in the Nisa Kamar series, and you can really find that it can relate, especially to a lot of the teenage readers?
Well, right at the beginning, what I wanted to do is even document some of my own memories from childhood. So one of the things I touch on is, when you go out on the night before Ramadan Eid al-Fitr, and you're looking for the moon, and all the neighbors. I grew up in a small town, so all the neighbors would come out onto the street, and we'd look for the moon together. We'd be playing cricket on the street in the evening, and the aunties would send pies and samosas across the road, whatever you've cooked for the day or whatever, you know. So those were the kinds of intimate memories that came up while I was trying to put myself into the body of a 10-year-old child growing up all over again. And it was a fantastic experience for me because there's that simple innocence of childhood that we almost forget. And you see it now with the next generation growing up in front of us. But we're so much more like sort of into technology than we were back then, where we spent time playing cricket in the street or riding our bicycles or whatever the case might have been. And in book one, Nisa loves her bicycle. I did once upon a time as well. And then there was also this opportunity to talk about things like why they told us to close the curtains at Maghrib time. You know, so kids find it like this boring chore, but there's an understanding behind it. And so I talk about things like that, and I talk about Mendi. You know, we use a cone on Eid night, and everybody's ready with the Mendi cone. But back when I was growing up, we mixed the Mendi fresh. We used a toothpick, and then had to learn how to use the toothpick to create those designs and patterns. I talk about little incidental things that that are also sort of when my adult readers read the Nisa Kamar series, they go, "Oh, I remember that." And when younger readers read it, they go, "You know, were you alive when the dinosaurs were around or something?" So, so it's been an opportunity and a platform to move back between my childhood and the childhoods that I'm watching in front of me as well. And it's really been a fun exercise. But at the same time, there are social issues that needed to be discussed, you know, and shyness and the way children respond in the classroom situation, the group dynamic also talks about trauma and dissociation. Children don't always feel like they can speak up in the classroom unless they're seen and validated. When she solves the problem of the Master of Jinyaville, she's seen by her peers, she's validated by having done something. She's not so shy anymore. The legend of Kothar, you know, about sort of the story of abundance. She learns that by reading a book. She learns that through reading a book, and she discusses it with a friend on the bus. The Rainbow Healer Society was special for me because that wasn't necessarily an adventure, but it looked at bullying in the classroom, which so many of our kids, boys and girls, do experience. And so it was ongoing. And then also the Circle of the Astral, the latest one, I really wanted to capture something of the pandemic in terms of the emotional experience that children are having, not talking about a virus as such, but talking about the limitations that were placed on them, but how quickly they solved the situation themselves, how quickly they jumped to the opportunity of sanitizers and masks, and they've been so diligent compared to a lot of adults. So I congratulate our children for the way that they've handled very uncertain and unpredictable circumstances. And this book is a tribute to that in its own way. And I hope that I have the opportunity to continue to develop Nisa Kamar and to continue to send some spark of joy for my younger readers.
Inshallah, Ameen. Thumma Ameen, do that. Sister Shafina has one final question. You know, you mentioned the empowerment of women and so many women doing great things beyond just being at home. You know, sisters like yourself who continue to write books and inspire those around you. You know, how does one, you know, as a woman who, you know, has, you know, is empowered herself, you know, how does one find that empowerment along with, you know, for example, looking after a family and being the role model as a mother? And how important is that our sisters and the women of our country, you know, find that balance to be that independent woman who makes an impact outside her home, but also the woman that makes an impact within her home?
I think we're already surrounded by so many examples, not just currently, but through the generations. We all come from families of inspired women who literally held up were the fortresses for our communities, for our families, no matter what circumstances they dealt with, whether they were, you know, sort of financial sort of constraints, or whether they are continue to be whatever constraints, women are always rising above and creating these faith-based communities where they don't just help their own families, but they're extending themselves in so many ways. And so it would, I rather than giving advice, I would rather take from what I've viewed and being inspired by, and say that it's impossible not to notice what our women are doing out there and how they're able to navigate, juggle so many different roles, and that we have so much to be grateful for the inspiration that we see around us from our mothers and our sisters, um, who are handling all kinds of sort of matters, and always, playing their role, in whichever way they can. So I don't think I can actually give advice. I can just say, Subhanallah, for what I've witnessed in my
Alhamdulillah.
life, what I continue to witness, and what I continue to feel inspired by. And I hope that my books are tributary in so many ways in capturing the strength of Muslim women around me, of Muslim women in our community, and globally as well. I can only do that small little bit of tribute, and I hope that I can do justice in that way.
Amin, Thumma Amin. And Sister Shafina, as we'd like to say Jazakallah to you, may Allah continue to grant you the wisdom and the knowledge to continue to write these books and make an impact in our society. And we say Jazakallah to you so much for making the time for us.
Jazakallah for having me. I really appreciate the platform, Jazakallah.
No, the pleasure is all ours. Shafinaz has some author and public sociologist giving us an idea of the books that she has written and the upcoming novels that she'll be touching on, and of course just giving a sort of link of woman empowerment to those books. So that's all we have here on the Daily Survival. From myself, Faraz Patel, do take care. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.